My name is Philip, and I'm a PhD student at Linköping University in Sweden. And in this video I will present some results regarding concurrency from a phenomenographic study. Before starting my PhD, I have been teaching a course on concurrency. And as you all might know, concurrency is usually perceived as a difficult subject by students. But due to the rise of concurrent platforms and so on, it's increasingly important for students to learn. And this is basically the topic of my research. So naturally the first question that strikes is, why is concurrency difficult? I will not attempt to answer that question here, because that's the overarching goal of my research. Previously at ICER, I have looked into what mistakes are commonly made by students, so to better understand what difficulties students face, and to start to try to answer the overarching question of why concurrency is difficult. And in this paper, I will look into how students perceive the concepts and how students understand these concepts. And the goal of this is to be able to better aid students to achieve a high level of understanding in the end. In doing this, I'm using a method called phenomenography. It's a qualitative research method, and it's based on a second-order perspective. For example, as I'm trying to illustrate by the picture over there. So what's important in this picture is that the researcher is not looking at the students. The researcher is actually looking at the relation between the students and the object of learning, concurrency in this case. As phenomenography is a qualitative method, data is usually collected from fairly small sample sizes and collected from semi-structured interviews. According to phenomenography, an aspect of an object of learning can only be perceived due to observing change in that aspect. And as such, the goal of a phenomenographic study is to observe these important aspects by looking at variation in these aspects. When data has been collected from the semi-structured interviews, the researcher will look through these interviews and pick out quotes that highlight these changes in critical aspects of the objects of learning, and then sorts them into piles of basically grouping them according to what aspect of the object of learning is highlighted by that particular quote. And as such, the researcher ends up with a few piles that highlight a number of these critical aspects. This is of course done iteratively, because the first time you try to sort them, you don't really know what you're going to find. So this is done over and over until you find which piles represent the data the most. It can be thought of as a kind of clustering, where you try to draw lines between different quotes on a surface somewhere to group them according to where the data fits best. In the end, these groups are documented and described what they mean, and then presented in relation to each other. In this case, data was collected from two courses on concurrency and operating systems at Linköping University. Both are given during the spring semester of the second year for students. One is given for a 3-year computer science program, and that one is, as you can see, split into two parts. First, 6 credits of operating system theory, and then 4 credits with lab sessions and where concurrency is introduced. The second course is given for 5-year computer science students and for master students. In this case, everything is given more condensed and only during the first half of the spring semester. In this case, the data was collected approximately halfway through the second course, all the way to the end of the semester. And 5 students from the 3-year program participated, and while 9 students from the 5-year computer science students participated. As I said before, data was collected using semi-structured interviews, lasting from between 30 to 70 minutes, depending on the conversation with the subject. The interviews were conducted by a teacher that was not involved in the relevant course, in order to not make the students feel like they have to answer correctly but rather to express more accurately how they actually experienced the particular topics discussed. So for example, since I was a teacher in the course for the 3-year programs, I did not perform the interviews of those students until after the course had concluded. The initial questions asked during the interviews were, how would you describe concurrency? And how would you describe a critical section, in order to get the students to try to describe their feelings. Of course, follow-up questions were asked as needed in order to make the students explore their understanding of the object of learning in sufficient depth. Based on the interviews, we found 6 categories representing the different ways in which students view concurrency. As you can see, they are organized into a hierarchy of 2 levels. On the first level, we have the division category. This represents how a problem is divided into multiple parts. And as one student described, I would describe it as a way of working simultaneously at the problem. A problem that you are able to divide into 2 or more pieces that can be worked on simultaneously. From this quote, we can see that this student experiences concurrency as a way of potentially dividing a problem into multiple independent parts, so that this student experiences both problems that need to stick together in order to work properly and problems that can be split into multiple parts that can execute independently of each other. The next category is realization. And this is described by this particular student as when you do one thing, then pause everything, save your settings in a special field, then jump to something else. In this case, the student is describing context switching as we have done in the course. And due to this description, we can hypothesize that the student contrasts it with no concurrency at all, due to the description of how you achieve concurrency without having multiple physical cores. And of course, having multiple physical cores is one other way of realizing concurrency, and another end of the spectrum is having no concurrency at all. The next category is cooperation. One student spoke about cooperation in terms of a program doing multiple things simultaneously, but that are independent of each other, that we can see from this quote. But it becomes very bothersome to, in every program, you develop things that everything needs to happen in one sequence without interruptions here and there. For example, we want to be able to do user input. In this case, we can see that the student is thinking about a case where a program tries to do multiple things that are largely independent of each other. For example, waiting for user input while doing something in the background. The fourth category, performance, takes the aspects discerned by the division and realization categories and also discerns the aspect of performance, which means that the students can reason about the performance of their solution depending on how they choose to divide the problem into multiple parts and how concurrency is actually realized on the particular platform. This is illustrated by the following quote. I guess the biggest thing is to be able to squeeze a bit more performance. There's a limit to the clock frequency of a CPU, so you need to do many things simultaneously. And in this particular case, the student reasons about that you need to take a problem and split it into multiple independent parts in order to gain more performance out of your program, which is needed because you have more cores in recent CPUs and the clock frequency doesn't increase as much anymore. The fifth category is communication. And this category combines aspects of both division, realization, and cooperation, and speaks about the program on a higher level in regards to what parts of the program need to talk to each other in order to make a concurrent solution work properly. And this is described by the following quote fairly well. For me, concurrency is like separating things and be sure that everything works fine, even with the separation. For example, 2 cores are trying to read and write at the same place, so you have to schedule to separate, to wait or not to wait. And in this case, the student was describing a project that involved a lot of matrix multiplications that needed to be distributed onto many cores for performance, but focused on the communication requirements between all of these small tasks that needed to be coordinated. The final category found with regards to concurrency is responsiveness, which takes the aspect found in the realization category and combines them with insights found by the cooperation category in order to start reason about how responsive a program is. This is very well illustrated by a student who was talking about a project that involved building a robot. We opted to make 2 threads in our robot, one in charge of communication and one in charge of most of the movements and thinking. Since they were working in parallel, there is less time stalling. What the student describes here is that they used 2 threads in order to make programming easier, basically, by having one thread that was waiting for incoming messages and reacting to them, while other threads were doing heavy processing. And this is very closely tied to cooperation that focused on mostly unrelated things happening more or less simultaneously, but the gain was not to increase performance or anything like that, but rather so that blocking tasks did not block other important tasks. For critical sections, we found 4 different categories, 2 related to the data itself and 1 related to the code. And the last one is combining the 2 aspects. For the code aspect, the focus is on the program code, and this is illustrated by the following quote. It is a place where no one else may disturb, where no context switches may occur. You are changing something and you should not be disturbed, really. In this case, we can see that the student focuses almost entirely on the code itself that is inside the critical section, mostly ignoring the fact that there is data being protected. This is in contrast to the next category, shared data, where focus is almost entirely on the data itself, which is illustrated by the following quote. Yeah, I suppose the actual critical section should be the data itself that you need to be careful about accessing concurrently. And in this quote we can, as I said, see that the focus is on the data. But we don't have any focus on what you need to do with the data. It's just that a critical section protects the data. In the next category regarding data rights, the students have additional insights regarding what may or may not happen with the data inside a critical section. Namely that inside a critical section, a thread usually writes to the data, which is illustrated by the quote here. When 2 processes are in conflict, when at least when they share data and at least one of them wants to write while the other either wants to read or write, which is basically stating the requirements for there to be a data race in the code, which indicates that this particular students understand that something needs to write to the data in order for there to be a problem. The final category combines these 2 strains of insights into a category called atomicity. In this category, students view the whole package with data and the code operating on the data as a package into an operation that needs to be seen from other places as either entirely completed or not started at all. This is illustrated by the following quote. It could be that multiple try to read a value or a variable simultaneously, but it could be modified either there or from someone else. But we need exactly what was there at the moment we entered the critical section. From this quote, we can see that this student has understood that there might be multiple locations in the code where the same data is accessed, either read or modified, and that the important point is that all instances where the data is accessed need to see the data in a consistent state. Since there were only 14 participants in this study, we cannot say anything about how common these categories are in a classroom, for example. We do, however, have earlier qualitative data from these same courses, not the same year, however, that was presented in ICER last year, though. And using these 2 datasets, we can try to combine them and thus estimate how common each of these categories are. This could be useful to get a rough idea of where we should start putting most focus when teaching these subjects. If we start looking at the concurrency part of the study, The cooperation aspect corresponds fairly well to how many students manage to correctly identify the concurrency issue in the question asked in the ICER study. If the students manage to find the issue, they understand how different parts cooperate in order to achieve a common goal. So this means that the cooperation aspect was discerned by approximately 80% of students. The division aspect corresponds fairly well with lock placement in the ICER study, because if the students have discerned the division aspects, they will manage what kind of work items are not related to each other, and thus if students discern the division item, they should be able to place the synchronization primitives at the instance level or at the individual element level, not at the global level. Thus we can estimate the number of students who discerned the division aspect to be roughly 62%. From this data we can also estimate how commonly the performance aspect is discerned. Students who have discerned the performance aspects are most likely to use one lock for each element in order to maximize the theoretical performance in this case, and thus we have a rough estimation of 12% for that category. The communication category is not as commonly discerned, as can be seen by the number of students who managed to correctly synchronize the solution, which was between 44% in this case and 62% in an earlier exercise. Thus we can estimate that the communication category is discerned by between 44 and 62% of students. The motivation entry in this table represents students who had an incorrect solution but argued why their solution would be correct if you use a particular concurrency model, namely context switching, which is slightly more forgiving than the general model used in computers nowadays. From that insight, we can get a grasp on the number of students that managed to discern the realization category, but this is only in particular cases, so we don't actually know too much. The responsiveness category, similarly, wasn't covered by the exercise at all, so we have no idea on that one either. In both of the incorrect locking categories in the graph, we can see two subcategories, both too small and split critical sections. The too small critical sections likely represent that students have not discerned the code categories, since they don't see the code and the data as a whole in that particular case. And as such, we can see that the code is not discerned by approximately 21% of students. The number of students who fail to discern the shared data category can likewise be estimated by looking at the students who synchronize the add and get functions separately. Since that particular solution only focused on the code aspect entirely, we can conclude that no or very little focus on the data is present in that particular case, and that the shared data category is not discerned by approximately 27% of students. Furthermore, the 3% of students who split their critical sections into multiple pieces most likely did not discern that writes are important for a critical section, and as such, writes are most likely not discerned by approximately 30% of students. Finally, atomicity, as we said earlier, is the combination of the code aspects and the data aspects of critical sections, and thus atomicity is not discerned by 21% plus 30%, 51%. And to put these numbers into better context, we can invert them so that we can see how many percent of students actually manage to discern them, and thus we can see that about half manage to discern the atomicity aspect of critical sections. So in conclusion, we managed to find 6 ways of experiencing concurrency and 4 ways of experiencing critical sections. From these results, we also tried to estimate how common the different categories were, so that we can both see which aspects are visible to the students, and we have some grasp of how commonly students see these particular categories as well. And this in turn could give us a possible order in which concept could be introduced, or perhaps which of these can be focused more on in order to try to make more students see all of these aspects. That's all for me. Thank you for watching the video.